Good evening, everybody. Let's take our seats. Let's get ready to get into the Word. If you guys have your Bibles with you, turn to Daniel chapter 5. If you don't have a Bible, make sure you grab one in the back. It's important that you have one so you can follow along with me in the Word. It's important that you know your sword. We're going to just continue in our study through Daniel tonight. We've made it all the way to Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5. So turn with me to Daniel chapter 5. If you're there, I just want to remind you guys of what happened last week, where we were last week in Daniel chapter 4. So last week, we looked at the end of Nebuchadnezzar's life, really, the testimony of Nebuchadnezzar, right? As we read through chapter 4, we did the whole chapter in one night because it's really a testimony. It's a single testimony of Nebuchadnezzar. It's his testimony in his own words. It's an official written decree to all the peoples, all the nations, all the languages of the earth. Nebuchadnezzar writes this out, and he says he thinks it's good that he should declare these things that the Most High God, the miracles, the signs and wonders that the Most High God did for him, right? And then we go through this crazy testimony of Nebuchadnezzar that the Lord made him mad, crazy, right? Made him think he was an ox. He lived out in the field with the oxen, ate grass for 7 years. He was humbled. His kingdom was taken from him, everything, until he came to understand that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men and sets over it whomever he wills, even sometimes the basest of men, right? So he brings Nebuchadnezzar to this realization that God, the very God of heaven, the holy God, is in charge of everything. He's sovereign. He reigns. He rules in heaven. And so we see that Nebuchadnezzar, this pagan king, this bloodthirsty, just murderous king, comes to the end of himself and is humbled until he declares that the holy God, the God of Israel, is the king of heaven. I love that. He calls him the king of heaven. And it's my conviction, and I really believe it, that we will see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. I believe that. I think he got saved. I mean, look at the testimony of Nebuchadnezzar. Look at what he proclaims of God at the end of chapter 4. I just want to read this starting in verse 34. He says, "And at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?' And at the same time my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom my honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles resorted to me. I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth and his ways justice, and those who walk in pride he is able to put down." Those who walk in pride he is able to put down. Listen, he's saying that from his own experience. He has experienced it, right? As he stands upon the palace of Babylon and he looks out at this great city and he says, "Look at this Babylon that I have made for my own majesty, for my own glory." And in that very moment, while the words were still in his mouth, the words fell from heaven that he was going to be driven from men, that he was going to be made to eat grass like an oxen. He was humbled. He recognized those who walk in pride, the God of heaven is able to put down. Now, as we jump into chapter 5, it goes right alongside chapter 4 in the sense that here we see a prideful king walking in pride and being humbled and coming to extol and honor and praise the King of heaven. And then we see on the other side of that a king who does not do that. So chapter 5 starts out Belshazzar the king. Now all of a sudden we go from Nebuchadnezzar being the king. Now in chapter 5 we enter into this kingdom of Belshazzar. Now who is Belshazzar? Now listen, this has been the center of controversy for a long time. Bible critics, I remember when we first started the book of Daniel, I told you guys that the book of Daniel falls under heavy, heavy criticism, right? The critics are always trying to poke holes in the book of Daniel because it is so precise, because it is so exact, because it is so right on the money, and it shows how sovereign and all-knowing and all-powerful God is. Because of that, it falls under just tight scrutiny all the time because people want to prove that it's not real. They want to show you that the book of Daniel is not real because if it's real, then there is really a God in heaven. If Daniel wrote this book when he was taken away captive into 605 BC, Babylon falls in 536 BC, and if that was true, if Daniel writes this in that time, then there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, who knows all things, who sets up the kingdoms of men and reigns over them and sets over them whomever he wills, even sometimes the basis of men. Because if Daniel could write these things in such exact and precise prophecy, even to the very days, names, dates, hours, the way that he does, if that's true, then God is true. If that's true, then these things are real, and they don't want that to be true. Ultimately, Romans 1 tells us that every man knows there's a God. Every man is without excuse before God, but he suppresses the truth in unrighteousness because he doesn't want it to be true. He doesn't want there to be a God. He doesn't want to have to be accountable to the God of heaven, the God who wrote this book. And so that's why they're always trying to poke holes in it. And for many, many, many years, they would use this name, Belshazzar, and they would say, listen, we have no written history of a king named Belshazzar in Babylon. It didn't exist. Therefore, Daniel's wrong. This is a flaw in Daniel, right? Now listen, for years, Bible scholars would try to defend this and come up with all kinds of ways of how to defend why this name is in there, and they weren't sure, but they would come up with all kinds of reasons why. Here's the thing about the Word of God, is it doesn't need us to defend it, right? Charles Spurgeon famously said, I would no sooner defend the Word of God than I would defend a lion. You don't defend a lion, you just let him out of his cage. He does just fine on his own. And the same is true with the Word of God. If God says it, let God be true and every man a liar, right? And so now recently, they found cuneiform tablets. It's called the Nabonidus cylinder. And it's a cuneiform tablet that was found by archaeologists, and it gives a description of Nabonidus and his son, Belshazzar. It talks about the king, Belshazzar. And so all these critics that for years have been saying the book of Daniel is wrong, this was a mistake here written, obviously, Daniel doesn't know what he's talking about, it wasn't really written by Daniel, and they made a mistake here and entered in a name that shouldn't have been there because there was no king, Belshazzar, and now they've been found out wrong. Not only that, but the Babylonian Chronicles have now been interpreted. And in the Babylonian Chronicles, it gives us the kings and their dates of kingship, right? When they came onto the throne, when they left the throne, and clearly it gives us the king Belshazzar. Now what happens is Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562 BC after like 43 years of reigning. Nebuchadnezzar dies, and then his son, Evil Marduk, which is a crazy name, that's really his name, he takes the throne. Now, he only reigns for 2 years, and then he's assassinated by a guy named, let me see if I can read his name, Nergal-Lezer. And he is the brother-in-law of Evil Marduk, right? He's married to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. And he thinks that he has the rightful heir to the throne, so he murders his brother-in-law so then he can take the throne. He only reigns for 4 years, then he dies, and his son, Labishi-Marduk, he takes the throne. And now we're not really sure about him. I've read a lot of different commentaries. I've read a lot of different historians on this, and they all seem to differ on this guy. Either he was mentally handicapped or he was a young child. Some will say he was a young child when he took the throne. His father died early. He took the throne, basically got inducted as the king, as a young king, as a child king. Or he was mentally handicapped, one of the two. And then he only reigns for a short amount of time, and he's beaten to death. And then the people who beat him to death put in his place Nabonidus. Now, Nabonidus is married to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. So Nabonidus takes the throne. He doesn't have the rightful position as the king, but the ones who basically murdered this mentally handicapped guy, they put him in place as the king. He's the general of the Babylonian army. So they put him in place as the king, and then he has a son with Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, and his son's name is Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar is the rightful heir to the throne because he's in the line of Nebuchadnezzar. And so Nabonidus rules for a while, but Nabonidus didn't really love the city of Babylon. He was a historian. Actually, he was an archaeologist, and he would go into the Persian desert and dig for all kinds of archaeological finds. And that's what he did in his spare time. And eventually, he leaves the city of Babylon and appoints Belshazzar as his co-regent, as kind of co-king over the city of Babylon and the province of Babylon. So Nabonidus is the king, Belshazzar is his son and is the co-regent or the co-king over the city of Babylon and reigns in city of Babylon proper. And so what's awesome about that is Daniel knows this. By the time Herodotus comes on the scene, 90 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, 90 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, Herodotus knows nothing of Belshazzar. So even Herodotus is trying to make sense of things. He doesn't know anything. He says that Nabonidus and Belshazzar are two different names for the same guy. So even by the time Herodotus, 90 years later, he comes on the scene, he doesn't even know about Belshazzar. Now, what does that mean for the book of Daniel? Why is that important? Why is it important that even Herodotus, 90 years later, doesn't know? Because the critics of Daniel try to say that it was written somewhere 100 years before Christ, when it was really written 500 years before Christ. But even 90 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, nobody knows about Belshazzar. No, even Herodotus, a historian, doesn't know about him. That's important because it goes back to the authenticity of the writer, Daniel, saying that he actually wrote this in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, in the time of the Babylonian army, in 500, 600 years before Christ. It's pretty amazing. What's really cool about that is that when the Word of God says something, we can bank on it, we can trust it, even when archaeology hasn't yet caught up to it. So what is our standard of truth? Our standard of truth is the Word of God. Our standard of truth is the Bible. We pick it up, we read it, it's true, and anything that doesn't agree with it is simply not true. It's that easy. This is our standard of truth. Now, we can look to things of the world like history and science and archaeology. We can look to those things, and inasmuch as they agree with the Word of God, we can say amen to that and use that as a bolster for our faith. But ultimately, first and foremost, we hold the Bible up as true on its own. It needs nothing else. It is the Word of God, the infallible Word of God. And anytime that, as archaeology gets further and further, what they do is they just continue to confirm and confirm and confirm the things that we find in Scripture, which is awesome for us, right? So here we see that name, Belshazzar. Now, we have no problem with that. We know exactly who he is now. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Now remember when we read all the way back in chapter 1, when Daniel was taken away captive into Babylon, and I told you when Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city of Jerusalem, and he went into the holy temple, and he brought with him some of the holy artifacts of the temple of God, and brought him to the temple of his God, to the treasure house of the temple of his God. I told you that was important. Well, here is why it's important. Because some 70 years later, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar is having this drunken party with 1,000 of his lords, and he brings out these articles. He brings out the artifacts, the holy artifacts from the temple of Jerusalem, right? And so Belshazzar the king, he makes a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and they're drinking wine. And then in verse 2 it says, while he tasted the wine, and that gives the implication that while he was drunk, he was not in his right mind, he was under the influence of alcohol, and while he was drunk, he makes this really bad decision. It says, while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar, now when it says father there, you have to understand that in Aramaic, there is no word for grandfather. It's just father. And the same in the Hebrew. There is no word for grandfather. Sometimes it would be our father's father, but it's always father. So what his father, Nebuchadnezzar, actually his grandfather, had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. Now what's going on here? I just want to set the scene for you guys, okay? Here they are in Babylon, in this basically party house that they have. In fact, they've uncovered the ruins of this place. It's something like 173 feet long and 53 feet wide. It's this giant room, and they're just having a drunken party. In fact, they're having a drunken orgy. These concubines that are present there, the only thing that they're for is for pleasure. That's it. That's the only thing they have them for. So here they are, getting drunk. They're committing debauchery, and they're bringing out the articles from the temple of God to drink wine out of them. And this is a common practice that pagan kings would do. And when they would raid a temple, they would bring these artifacts from the temple, these holy artifacts. They would place them in the treasure house of their own temple, and they would do things like this. They would have drunken parties. They would drink out of these artifacts to show that their God is greater than the God that they conquered, the God of the temple that they conquered. And so here they are doing that, right? Now in verse 5 it says, "In the same hour the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other." I like the King James here. The King James says that the joints of his loins were loosened, and his knees smote one against another. I love that. The joints of his loins were loosened. Now here it's translated as hips, right? But in Isaiah it's translated, it says, he looses the armor of kings, right? In the New King James. In the King James, it's the same word. He loosens the loins of kings. Now, in Isaiah, that word that for loins can only be translated loins. Can't be translated hips or joints or anything like that. And so many Bible commentators for a long time have thought that here, Belshazzar pees his pants. I love that. I hope that's true. I really hope that's true. Now think about it. Here you are having a party, right? You're doing something that intuitively you know, because you're made in the image of God. You know right from wrong. No one has to tell you that it's wrong to have this kind of celebration. No one has to tell you that it's wrong to take these holy articles of the Most High God and use them for this depraved activity. Belshazzar knows about the God of Israel, by the way. He knows about him. And here he is in the midst of this crazy party, and he takes the articles from the house of the holy God and he uses them to commit sin against that God, right? He knows that it's wrong. And then all of a sudden, fingers appear and they begin to write on the wall. I like that. It just says, fingers of a man's hand appear. Can you imagine? Now, picture the scene. Here you are, knowing somewhere inside you, unless your conscience is completely seared, knowing that something is wrong about what you're doing, and all of a sudden, the fingers, this phantom hand appears and begins to write on the wall. Right away, man, something happens in Belshazzar, and he is freaked out. His knees are knocking. Hopefully he peed his pants. We're not really sure. And he knows he's done wrong. It says the king's countenance changed. Literally, it means the king's countenance lightened. It means the color ran out of his face. He went white. His knees are knocking, literally. He's terrified. He knows something. He knows there is a serious significance behind this hand and behind the writing. It says the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. I love this because, again, we see this same ragtag bunch of guys coming in, trying to interpret, trying to give wisdom, and they have none to give. They have no wisdom. Right away, what does the king do? He looks to the systems of the world. He looks to the systems of Babylon. Right away, he cries for the Chaldeans, for the magicians, for the soothsayers, for the wise guys to come in. He needs some help here, and he's looking to the systems of the world to help him. So he cries aloud. He says, bring in all these guys, and they come in. And then he says, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Interesting, right? The third ruler in the kingdom. Why does he offer that position? Why does he offer the position of the third ruler in the kingdom? because he's the second ruler in the kingdom, right? His father, Nabonidus, is the king. He's the co-king. All he can offer is the third highest in the kingdom, right? He says, look, whoever can come in and give me the interpretation, who can read this and give me the interpretation. Isn't this so familiar? Nebuchadnezzar twice had a dream that he couldn't interpret. Nebuchadnezzar twice had a dream where he calls in all the wise men and says, look, whoever can tell me the dream and its interpretation, I'm going to give high honor in this place. I'm going to give the second most powerful man in all of Babylon. And here, again, the man who's in charge, God shows his power and he needs interpretation. And he calls for the wise men of Babylon to come in and give him interpretation. Whoever can do this will be the third most powerful man in Babylon. Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. I wonder if ever in the history of Babylon, if these wise men ever gave a correct interpretation of anything. I wonder if they were ever able to do it. Now remember, when we look back at chapter 2, when we were going through the first time we were introduced to these guys, I told you that they're basically politicians. They have political power within the kingdom of Babylon. They have position within the kingdom of Babylon. And they just want to keep that position. That's all they want to do. They're always vying for position. They're always vying for power. They never want to say the wrong thing. Why? Because these kings were prone to losing their temper. They had all the power. And they could just kill anyone they ever wanted to at any time they wanted to kill them. And so these men come in, and they can't give interpretation. They can't read what the writing says. And even if they could read what the writing says, they couldn't interpret it. They don't know. They have no real wisdom to give. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. Now, this queen is not Belshazzar's wife. Because remember, who was there at this party? It was Belshazzar, his wives, and his concubines, and his lords. All of his wives were there. Now, this queen is the queen mother. This is Belshazzar's mom, most likely. This is the wife of Nabonidus, which means she is the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. Now look at how the queen talks to him. This is amazing. The queen comes without invitation to the banquet, right? She comes without invitation to the party because she has the authority to do that. She has the authority to speak directly to Belshazzar without an invitation because she has that authority within the kingdom of Babylon. She comes in and she speaks directly to her son and she says, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy God. Sounds familiar to what Nebuchadnezzar said, isn't it? And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king. Now she reiterates that, and I really believe this is like a dig to Belshazzar. Like, you're not the real king, neither is Nabonidus, but Nebuchadnezzar was the true king of Babylon. He was the one and only great king of Babylon. And he came to realize that in this man was the spirit of the holy God, and he came to worship that God. And now here you are having this drunken party, and your loins are loosened and you don't know what to do. Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. Now, another thing that's very interesting about this is this queen uses Daniel's Hebrew name, just like Nebuchadnezzar does back in chapter 4. When Nebuchadnezzar comes to understand who Daniel's God is, and he puts Daniel's God in the right place in his own mind, he calls Daniel by his Hebrew name. And now here, this queen, this daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, no doubt knew the story, no doubt knows everything that happened with her father when he went crazy, when he came to know who the true and living God was, when he came to worship Daniel's God and calls him Daniel. Now she is giving Daniel that same honor. and even Daniel's God that same honor, because she says, in him is the spirit of the holy God. Now remember, the gods of the Babylonians were not holy. The Babylonians didn't even think they were holy. They were just as depraved as the Babylonians were. They never even made the claim that they were set apart. They were just as depraved as the people who worshiped them. But here, this queen is saying, in this Daniel is the spirit of the holy God, the God that is set apart, the God that is different from our gods. And he has great wisdom. Look at what she says about him. Light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. So she says, look, just call Daniel. He'll know. Call Daniel. He'll be able to come in. He'll be able to read this. He'll be able to give the interpretation. Look at the confidence that she has in Daniel. She must know him. Now, I want to point something out to you. As a king, if you got a guy like Daniel, as a leader, if you got a guy like Daniel in your kingdom and you're not utilizing him, that's bad leadership. That's just bad leadership. If you're calling for guys and you know of this guy Daniel, which, by the way, Belshazzar knows of Daniel. You're going to see that in just a moment. He knows of him. And if you know of a guy like Daniel and you're not utilizing him within your kingdom, you are a bad king. You're a bad leader. And so she says, look, call in Daniel. So verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard of you that the light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now look at what he says. When Daniel comes before the king, what does he say? Are you that Daniel? Are you that Daniel that my father the king brought from Judah as one of the captives of Judah? He knows of him. Now something that you need to understand is that when Nebuchadnezzar went through all this stuff that we read about in chapter 4, Belshazzar was like 12 to 16 years old. He knew about it. He was a witness to it. He was there when it happened, and he was there when Nebuchadnezzar sent forth the decree that everyone should worship the God of Israel, that everyone should worship the Most High God. This isn't some ancient story about some ancient king in the past of Babylon. This only happened 23 years ago when Belshazzar was a teenager. He knew about it. And here he is, 23 years later, in a powerful position within the kingdom of Babylon, and he is worshiping the gods of Babylon again, and he's committing blasphemy against the God of Israel. As if to say, the gods of Bel and Marduk and all these gods are more powerful than the God of Israel. And then when Daniel comes before him, he says, hey, are you that Daniel that I've heard of that has done all these amazing things? He's never even met him. Here you've heard the stories. He's grown up hearing the stories of Daniel, hearing the stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. No doubt he's heard of the God of Israel and what he's done in the presence of Nebuchadnezzar. And here he comes to authority and power as the second highest ruler in the kingdom of Babylon, and he's never even met Daniel. How crazy is that? To put yourself in that position, and if you heard all these stories about this man Daniel, wouldn't you want to meet him? And you have the authority to call whoever you want to call before the throne. You can call anyone you want to before the throne, and you would want to meet this guy. But Belshazzar is so wrapped up in his pride that he cares nothing about the God of Israel and cares nothing about Daniel. Daniel was the prime minister of Babylon for 40 years when Nebuchadnezzar was the king. In the heyday of Babylon, while it was its most powerful, Daniel was the second most powerful man in the kingdom of Babylon, ruling over 100 provinces. And Belshazzar wants nothing to do with him. Now all of a sudden he needs him. Now all of a sudden there's something that his wise men can't handle. There's something that he doesn't know the answer to. And he calls Daniel. Are you that Daniel I've heard of? I've heard of all that the Spirit of God is in you, that light and understanding, that you can give interpretations and solve enigmas. I've heard all these things about you, and yet I've never wanted to meet you. Now, if you can do all these things that they say about you, I'm going to give you a robe of purple. I'm going to put a chain on you. I'm going to make you the third most powerful man in the kingdom. He's promising Daniel position, authority, power, riches, all the things that Daniel has already had. He's already had all that. He's already had authority. He's already had position and prominence in the kingdom of Babylon, right? He's promising Daniel all these things. Now look at what Daniel says. Verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself. Let your gifts be for yourself. And give your reward to another. He's not interested in that. He can't be bought and paid for. He can't be bribed. Daniel doesn't care about position, power, authority, riches. He doesn't care about political strength. He's not for any of that. All he wants to do is be used of God. Look at what he says. Let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. I would imagine that right now Daniel is excited. He knows what's going on. When we get to chapter 7 and chapters 10, you'll see that when we get to these things that have been revealed to Daniel, they were actually revealed chronologically before chapter 5. So he has already seen these amazing visions given to him from God. He already knows what's going to take place in the history of men. He already knows what's going to happen after the fall of Babylon. He knows what's going to take place. All those things have already been revealed to him. So now he has the opportunity to come before the king and tell him what's about to happen. I imagine right now Daniel's excited. He's been waiting for his opportunity. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king. Now notice in verse 18, he doesn't say, O king, live forever. He doesn't give the normal political greeting that you were supposed to give to the king. He doesn't disrespect the king. He calls him the king, but he doesn't give him the normal political greeting of the day. He doesn't give him the, O king, live forever. Why? Because he knows he's not gonna. He knows exactly what's going to take place, right? O king. The Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Now look at what he says about Nebuchadnezzar. He doesn't say Nebuchadnezzar worked really hard for all this glory and majesty, right? He doesn't say that, that Nebuchadnezzar gained this kingdom by military pursuit or because he had this superior intellect. He doesn't say, what does he say? The Most High God gave your father majesty and glory and a kingdom. He gave it to him. And because of the majesty that God, the Yahweh, the God of Israel, gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. He's saying, look, Nebuchadnezzar was a king of kings. He was an absolute ruler. He was an absolute monarch. He did whatever he pleased in the kingdom of Babylon. If he wanted to raise someone up, he raised them up. If he wanted to execute someone, he executed them. Whatever he wanted to do, he did because of the excellent majesty and glory given to him by God. But when his heart was lifted up in pride, and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. And they fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. He knew it all. I love this because Daniel takes this opportunity before he gives him the interpretation, before he reads it. He's saying, look, I'll give it to you, but first you need to know this. Your father, your grandfather, the great king, King Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king that Babylon has ever seen, it was God who gave him this kingdom. It was God who gave him this majesty and glory. It was God who set him up to rule over the kingdoms of men. It was God who gave him that position, and he made him an absolute monarch, and he put him in this place where he could rule over men with absolute authority. Whoever he wanted to execute, he could execute. Whoever he wanted to raise up, he could raise up. Whoever he wanted to take down, he could take down. But then his heart was lifted up in pride. He hardened himself against God with pride, and God brought him low. He was driven from the kingdoms of men. He was made to eat grass like an ox in a field. He was wet with the dew of heaven. He lived outside. He was literally mad like an animal. He was given the heart of a beast until he came to know that the Most High rules. But you, Belshazzar, have not honored the God of heaven, even though you knew all these things. He was privy to it. He wasn't. It's not like he didn't know who the God of Israel was. He knew. And even knowing all of this, he didn't humble his heart. So what is the difference between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar? Well, the truth is really nothing. Nothing was the difference. They both were lifted up in pride. They both thought they could do whatever they want. Remember what Nebuchadnezzar first did. He's the one who took these articles from the holy God's temple. He's the one who took these holy articles from the temple and brought them to the treasure house of his own God, the temple of his own God. He's the one who desecrated the temple of God. He's the one who besieged Jerusalem. He's the one who laid waste to the holy city of God. He did all of those things. His heart was lifted up in pride, but eventually he was humbled. He came to understand who the God of Israel was. And now Belshazzar, already knowing who the God of Israel is, still lifts up his heart in pride and is not humbled before that God. So the difference between the two is that one humbled himself and one didn't. Belshazzar did not humble himself before the mighty hand of God, even knowing who he was. Although you knew all this, and you would have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hands and owns all your ways you have not glorified. I love that verse. I love that verse. Think about what he's saying. And you can imagine, Belshazzar is already afraid. He's already terrified. He knows there's serious significance behind the writing on the wall as the hand appeared and wrote the writing in the wall. Listen, we don't know how that took place. Did it write into the plaster? Did it write on top of the plaster? We don't know. Whatever happened, it freaks him out. He knows there's something serious going on here. And then here comes Daniel and he says, yeah, I'll give you an interpretation, but first you need to know this. He gives him the history of Nebuchadnezzar. He tells him what happened. And then he says, and you, knowing all of this, still have not humbled yourself, and you have lifted yourself up against the God of heaven. Look at what he says. You have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them. When it says that you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven, it's like you are warring against the God of heaven. Who do you think is going to win this one? Here you are, this earthly king, the second in the kingdom of Babylon, which hasn't seen its glory days since Nebuchadnezzar, who has been on steady decline. And now here you are, shut up in the gates of Babylon, thinking you're something, and you've lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You've declared war against him. Now you know he's freaked out. You know he's worried here. You've drank wine from them. You've praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see, hear, or know. These gods whom you're praising are nothing. Now, interestingly enough, in the Word of God, it says that those who worship the gods who are deaf and dumb and blind become like them. The gods who can't see, the gods who can't hear, the gods who can't speak, those who worship them become like those gods. Belshazzar is like his gods. He can't hear, he can't see. He doesn't know what's right in front of him. He can't see the blasphemy that he's committing against the God of Israel. And then he says, and the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways. I love that. Have you ever witnessed to somebody and begin to speak about them about Jesus and they say, look, I don't believe in that. That doesn't apply to me. I don't believe in that. As if just because they don't believe, it makes it not real for them. This era of postmodernism that we live in, like where truth is relative and your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. So as long as I don't believe that, then it doesn't matter. But here, Belshazzar doesn't believe in the God of Israel. He doesn't worship or follow the God of Israel. And yet, Daniel says of Belshazzar, the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways. Even though you don't honor him, even though you don't give him position in your life, even though he's not seated on the throne of your heart, he is still the God of heaven who owns all your ways and holds your very breath in his hand. That means that every moment that you're breathing is common grace that you are receiving from the God who sits on the throne of heaven. That means even those who are in rebellion against God, he's still having that window of grace open for them as he causes them to breathe their next breath. He holds your very breath in his hands. As believers, as Christians, that should rock us. Because every breath that you breathe is from him. That means every word that you speak, you're only able to speak that word because he gave you the breath to speak it. That should cause you to guard your words more closely, shouldn't it? When you recognize that he's the one who gave you the breath to speak them. Every time you speak a word against a brother or a sister, or every time you say something that you shouldn't be saying, it's the God of heaven who gifted you that breath to speak that word. And here he's making that clear to Belshazzar. Look, the God who gave Nebuchadnezzar his throne, the God who gave him this kingdom and his power and his authority and his majesty, that God is the God who holds your breath in his hands, who owns all your ways, and you have not honored him. You're blaspheming against him. You're taking the holy vessels from the temple and you're using them to commit sin against the God who gives you your life. Remember what Colossians says, that in him, in Jesus, all things consist. All things consist in him. What does that mean? It means he literally holds everything together. So that the fact that you're alive means he's still holding you together. All things consist in him. And yet Belshazzar has not honored him. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written, and this is the inscription that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Now it's interesting, and there's all kinds of debate about this as to why the wise men couldn't read this. And I don't really know. I don't think it's worth getting into that debate. I don't think it's worth speculating as to why the wise men couldn't read it. Maybe God blinded them to what it said. Maybe he wrote it in something that they couldn't read. And Daniel, what does it matter? What really matters is they were not able to read it, and Daniel was, because he has the Spirit of the Holy God who dwells within him, and he's brought before the king to prophesy over the king. That's the reality. So Daniel comes in and he reads this, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Now when he reads that, those are Aramaic words. So no doubt, Belshazzar knows what those words are. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And this is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So Daniel gives him this interpretation. First, he reads it, many, many tekel upharsin. Numbered, weighed, divided. That's basically what it means. Numbered, weighed, divided. That's what the words just, strictly, if you just read the words, that's what they say. And then he gives this interpretation and he says, Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Now remember, when he gives the interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, and he says, after you will arise a kingdom inferior to yours. And he basically gives Daniel the understanding that after Babylon will come another kingdom, and it's going to be at the end of 70 years. He knows specifically, exactly, that it's going to be 70 years. And Babylon reigns for 70 years. Daniel knows that God has numbered the days of the kingdom of Babylon. And here, he's given that interpretation to Belshazzar. And he's saying, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. It's done. The reign of Babylon is over. It's been finished. He already numbered it, and you've come to the end of your days. And, tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Now, what I find interesting about this is when Daniel gives Belshazzar the interpretation, think about how he gives King Nebuchadnezzar the interpretation in chapter 4. Remember when Nebuchadnezzar calls him in and Daniel sits astonished for a time. In the King James it says for an hour he just sat there. And he didn't sit there astonished because he didn't know the interpretation. He sat there astonished because he did, and he didn't want to give it to King Nebuchadnezzar. And he says, oh, King, I wish this was about your enemies. He had respect and love for Nebuchadnezzar. Now look at the difference when he speaks to Belshazzar. There's no waiting. There's no astonishment. There's no, oh, I wish this wasn't about you. He just gives it to him matter-of-factly. Mene, the kingdom has been numbered and it's finished. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. You have come up short. God has weighed you out and you've come up short. Perez. Now listen, the reason why it's Perez and not upharsin is Perez and upharsin is the same word. We don't have to get into all this. You guys probably don't care. I care. I find it interesting. In the language, in Aramaic, when you come to this word Perez, if you want to say and found wanting, you have to add this prefix to the word, which would be that word you. And if you add the you, then it becomes a soft P. Instead of Perez, it's fair. And so it would be you, far, and then at the end, zen, because you added that prefix. It has to have the suffix on the end. So it would be upharsin. It's the same word. But by itself, the word is Perez. So he comes to this last word, Perez. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Now what's cool about it is that word Perez is also used for Persians. It's the same word. It's really interesting. So as Daniel gives him this interpretation, Daniel knows exactly what's happening. So it's funny because as the king offers him the third most powerful position in the kingdom, Daniel knows that that's over. Why do I want to be the third most powerful man in the kingdom that is no more? It's like getting a promotion in a company that's gone bankrupt. It doesn't really, what is it good for? Daniel says, look, keep it for yourself. Give it to somebody else. I don't want it, because he knows that it's going away. So here he says, look, your kingdom has been divided and it's been given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. That very night. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, King Cyrus is the king of the Medes and the Persians. Darius is a ruler within the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians under King Cyrus. He has sent Darius in to besiege the city of Babylon. Now, I'm going to give you some history here. So we've read the biblical perspective from the inside. We know what's going on inside Babylon. They're having this crazy party. Now, history tells us what's going on the outside walls of Babylon at the very same time that King Belshazzar is throwing this crazy drunken orgy party, worshiping the gods of Babylon. Outside of the gates of Babylon, outside of the wall, the city is being besieged from the Medes and the Persians. They've come against the city, and actually in the region of Shinar, which Babylon is, they've actually already overtaken all of the provinces of Babylon, and they are rising to power. They've defeated everything except for Babylon proper, the actual city of Babylon. They're coming against the city of Babylon right now as they're having this party, and Belshazzar knows that that's going on. It's been going on now for almost 20 years. They've been overtaking the provinces of Babylon and coming to power. Babylon has been on a steady decline since the death of Nebuchadnezzar, and the kingdoms of the Medes and the Persians have been overtaking it slowly, province by province. They've been gaining power over Babylon. But Belshazzar shut up in the city. Even his father, Nabonidus, has come against King Cyrus and made war against him, trying to deliver the city of Babylon. They wiped out Nabonidus, and he flees. He runs away in defeat, and now they're coming against the city of Babylon. Now, I've told you guys a lot about the city of Babylon so far, right? That the wall was 350 feet tall, almost 90 feet thick, the outer wall of Babylon. 100 bronze gates, over 100 towers that reached even 100 feet above the wall. You're talking about 100 450-foot towers on a 350-foot wall. It's 15 miles square. It's got an inside wall, and in between the outer and inner wall were flocks where they could graze their flocks. They had a river that ran through the city. They had a constant supply of fresh water. They had 20 years of supplies where they never had to leave the city. They could be shut up in the city for 20 years, and they could graze their flocks inside the outer wall. And if someone happened to get through the outer wall, they were still stuck because they couldn't get through the inner wall, and they were like sitting ducks. They considered the city of Babylon to be impenetrable. There was no way to get in. And Belshazzar is so lifted up in pride that he thinks there's no way anybody can get him, and he's throwing this party. Now, King Cyrus comes against the city, and they've been besieging the city for a while, and they can't find a way in, right? Now, there's all kinds of different accounts. You can read Herodotus and Josephus, and they'll give you all these different ideas of how this happened. Some will say that King Cyrus came up with the idea himself, or there was defectors from the Babylonian army, or that they infiltrated the Babylonian army with their own guys. It doesn't really matter. Either way, they came up with this plan. Now, remember this, the river, the Euphrates River runs through Babylon, right? Runs right through the middle of Babylon, north to south. There's these great sluice gates, these iron gates so that no one could get in through the river, that would block the river. And so Cyrus has this idea, or he's given this idea, that they're going to divert the river into a nearby lake. So they dig a canal from the river Euphrates to this lake, and they divert the river into the lake. And the level of the river drops down so low that they're able to walk in under the sluice gates. And because Belshazzar is such a sloppy king, and he's so prideful, that literally the inside gates, these great iron gates on the inside wall, are open. They're just open. And the whole army of the Medes and the Persians just march into the gate, and they overthrow Babylon in one night without a war. Without a battle. They come in, they wipe out the city in one night. They kill, you can read in Josephus, the historian, you can read about this account, how they come right into this room and they kill Belshazzar at this table. In one night, they overthrow the city. It took them a week. Some people didn't even know for a week or two that Babylon had even been conquered. They didn't even know. Because there was no burning of the gates, there was no great battle, there was none of that. It was just in one night wiped out. Taken over. I mean, that's pretty cool history, right? That's pretty exciting to know how that takes place. Pretty cool. But turn with me really quick to Isaiah chapter 44. Now, you can give all the credit to Cyrus if you want, being this great military leader. I tend to give the credit to God, because Isaiah 44 was written 150 years before King Cyrus was born, okay? It was written 150 years before King Cyrus was even born, before the Medes and the Persians were even joined. The Medes and the Persians were two separate kingdoms even now. Nobody had even thought of the name Cyrus for the king of the Medes and the Persians yet. But in Isaiah 44, starting in verse 24. Now remember how he did it, right? He diverted the river. The river dried up. They could walk in under the gates. The gates were left open. They could just walk right into the city, right? Verse 24 says, "Thus says the Lord your Redeemer, and he who formed you from the womb. I am the Lord who makes all things, who stretches out the heavens all alone, who spreads abroad the earth by myself, who frustrates the sign of the babblers and drives diviners mad, who turns wise men backwards and makes their knowledge foolishness, who confirms the word of his servant and performs the counsel of his messengers, who says to Jerusalem, you shall be inhabited, to the cities of Judah you shall be built, and I will raise up her waste places, who says to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up your rivers, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple your foundation shall be laid. This is 150 years before Cyrus was born. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the armor of kings. Literally it says, and to loose the loins of kings. To open before him the double doors, so that the gates will not be shut. Are you kidding me? I will go before you and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that you may know that I, the Lord, who call you by your name, am the God of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake and Israel my elect, I have even called you by your name. I have named you, though you have not known me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. There is no God besides me. I will gird you, though you have not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun to its setting, that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity. I, the Lord, do all these things. How awesome is that? This is why the critics come so strong against the book of Daniel, come so strong against these prophetic books like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, because they have no answer. The problem is they'll come against this and say, well, this can't be true because there's no way anyone could know these things. That's right. There's no way anyone could know these things unless the God of heaven who reveals secrets reveals this to them. The truth is that God has said 150 years before King Cyrus was even born, look, Cyrus, I'm going to use you. You're my servant. I've girded you. I've strengthened you. I've named you, even though you haven't known me, just so they will know that I, the Lord, am God, and besides me there is no other. I am the God of Israel. And the Talmud tells us, and Josephus tells us, that when King Cyrus invaded Babylon and finally took it over, that an old 85-year-old man comes to Cyrus and reads from him out of Isaiah 44 and 45 and shows him that 150 years before he was born, that God of Israel already spoke of him and is using him as his own servant. That is amazing. Amazing. So what does this do for us? On this side of it, we look back, this is all fulfilled. Everything that God spoke beforehand has taken place. So what does that mean for us? That means that every promise that God has made, we can take it to the bank because it will happen exactly as He said it will happen. He's the one who declares all things. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He has declared the end from the beginning. He's the one who causes peace. He's the one who forms the light and creates darkness, makes peace and creates calamity. The Lord, He is the Lord, and He does all of these things. If God is for us, then who can be against us? If He is the one who sets up the kingdoms of men and places over them whomever He wishes, even sometimes the basest of men, when we see the news unraveling before us, what do we have to fear? everything, when it seems like it's falling out of place, when it's falling apart, it's just falling into place. God is accomplishing His will on the earth because He is ruler over it. No one can stay His hand or say to Him, "What have you done?" Do you believe that? Do we, as the children of God, as the sons and daughters of the Most High God, know who He really is? That He's the one who sets up all things. He's the one who tears kingdoms down and sets them up. He's the one who has declared the end from the beginning. He has spoken these things from eternity. They are written in eternity, and they will come to pass. We can bank on it, that all of the promises of God in Jesus are yes, and in Christ, amen. We can bank on them. That means when He says that He's gone to prepare a place for us, and that He will come again for us. And if He goes, that He's coming back. And that soon and very soon we'll see Him face to face. And on that day that the trumpet blows and we're called to Him, we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. And they can be a comfort to our hearts, knowing that if He's spoken them, then they are true, because He is truth. Not only does He say things that are true, He is truth. That means that everything He says is truth, and it's a promise, and we can bank on it. Amen? Let's pray. Lord, thank You for Your word. Lord, thank You for the surety of it, God. Thank You that we can trust it. Thank You that we can know You, Lord, and that we can fellowship with You, and that we can commune with You, the one who sets up the kingdoms of men. That You are our Father. And we can come boldly to the throne room of grace at any time, Lord, when we need mercy, when we need grace, when we need help. Lord, we can come to You, and even though You're the God who created the heavens, that You hold our breath in Your hands, that You incline Your ear to Your servants. Lord, I pray that if there's anyone in this room that feels far from You, Lord, that You would bring them near by Your Spirit right now. Lord, I pray that if there's any one of us who are feeling like we can't hear from You, like we haven't heard from You, Lord, I pray that You would speak to their heart even right now. Holy Spirit, would You confirm Your word in our hearts? Would You convince us of the truth of Your word by the power of Your Spirit? God, would You just set us on fire for Your word, for Your kingdom, for Your glory, Lord. Let us bring You glory in this world. Lord, we know our days are short, and we cry out, "Come quickly, Lord Jesus." We cry, "Maranatha." But even as You leave us here, Lord, as we're waiting for You, Lord, let us be busy about our Master's business. Lord, let us be working for You and bringing You honor, bringing more people into the kingdom, Lord. Let us share the gospel. Let it be fast on our lips, Lord, to anyone who would listen. We know the time is short. Father, we're expectant. We're excited to see You face to face. But until then, Lord, keep us faithful. Hold us to our inheritance by the power of God through faith. We thank You, Jesus. Amen. Amen. Man, I'm excited about chapter 6. Listen, if you're going to the pig roast this week, we got all the, this weekend, we got all the, everything set up as far as the hotel rooms. I just want to remind you guys to bring $25 for the hotel room if you're going. And if you're not going, then I guess we'll just tell you about it when we get back. And you'll be sad you didn't go. All right, until next week, until this weekend, actually, until Sunday, you guys be blessed. Amen.